This is my learner car. I've had it just under 8 years. I bought it new and it's done over 180,000 miles. That's with learners behind the wheel doing the worst type of driving you can think of. Stalling, stopping, starting, manoeuvring, lots of town slow driving as they learn to drive. Yet it drives like it's new. In fact, many people are very surprised when they find out just how many miles this car has on it. So in this video, I'm going to let you know what you can do to make your car last longer. Firstly, the most important thing you can do for a petrol and diesel car is check your oil. Make sure it's got between the min and max markers on the dipstick. Take dipstick out, wipe it down, put it back in, take it out, and then the oil should come up between the bottom and the top markings on the stick. But also change the oil, change it as per the manufacturer's recommendations, including the oil filter. Oil is critical when it comes to the longevity of your engine. Not only does it lubricate the engine and prevent metal on metal contact, but it traps contaminants, runs them through a filter to remove those contaminants from the engine. But as oil gets older, it becomes less effective at doing its job and it gets filled up with contaminants that can't be filtered out, which is why it's important to change oil periodically. The next most important thing is the cam belt, which is also known as the timing belt. It's located here on this engine and you can't see it because it's covered up. I'll show you what it looks like. See, a little belt like that with these teeth. And this is critical for your engine because if this fails, your engine pretty much destroys itself. There's really no way it's going to come back from that. The cost to repair it is too high. You're better off fitting a second-hand engine, and if the car's not worth much, you're probably going to end up scrapping it. Generally speaking, a safe bet is to replace these every 4 years or 60,000 miles, and the price can vary greatly from car to car. On this car, it's about £350 to do the job, including the parts, but it can be quite a bit more than that on some cars. So before you buy a car, it may be worth finding out how much it costs. On this car, it doesn't recommend I change the cam belt, which is not good advice. It actually says check it at 120,000 miles and then check it every 10,000 miles after that to check the condition of this belt. But this belt snapping isn't my main worry. Very strong, it's probably not going to snap. It's probably just going to get loose and then lose time, meaning your engine's going to destroy itself anyway. And how that's going to happen is because what holds the belt on are these things. This is an idler pulley and this is a tensioner. If you can see them there, they keep the belt firmly in place and in time. These get hot and cold as the engine gets hot and cold, and they spin a lot very quickly for a very long time, and they do fail, which is why even if your owner's manual says you don't need to replace your cam belt, I recommend you do. But some cars like this Mazda have a metal cam chain instead of a belt, and many manufacturers claim that the chain should last the life of the vehicle. But I don't trust that. It still has a tensioner and it still has guides keeping the chain on. Often the guides are made at least partly with plastic. I recommend changing the chain every 10 years or 100,000 miles, whichever comes first. But what exactly do they mean by the life of a vehicle? Well, I only know one person that's had a cam belt fail on them because people generally change cam belts. But I've lost count of how many people who have had cam chains fail on them because people generally don't change cam chains. So, when the car's 14 years old and the cam chain fails, well, that's the life of your vehicle because your car is now dead. The next thing I want to mention is your engine coolant. On this car, it's located here. That's the reservoir and it should be kept between min and max. It's important because it keeps your engine from overheating, and when your engine overheats, it can fail beyond repair. When it comes to topping it up, keep the colours the same. If you have blue coolant, keep it blue. If you have pink, keep it pink. They are different chemicals, and when you mix them together, they can form this gel-like substance which clogs up your cooling system. It's not just a case of keeping it topped up though, because you do have to replace it periodically. How often? Well, refer to your owner's manual. If you let the coolant get too old, it can go from alkali to acid, which then can cause electrolysis within the walls of your cooling system, which leads to corrosion and then you can get pinholes and leaks, and they can be very expensive to repair. Also, coolant gets less effective at protecting the engine when it's very cold and very hot as it gets older, so it's important to replace it for that too. At the end of this video, I'll show you 3 ways you can check your coolant to make sure it's still good. The final major thing to consider is the gearbox oil. Many manufacturers claim that their manual gearboxes have sealed for life oil, which means you should never change it. But I had the gearbox oil in this car for 80,000 miles and the gears got very notchy. Once I changed the gear oil though, the gears were like new again. So now I change it every 40 or so thousand miles. Also, if you've crunched the gears a few times or you regularly hear that sound when you put it in reverse, it's not a bad idea to change the gear oil, because you can have tiny little bits of metal floating around in the gear oil causing havoc to your gearbox. There are magnets at the bottom of the gearbox to collect those particles, but it's better to be safe than sorry. This Mazda MX-5 was released in 2016, and the 2016 cars are renowned for gearbox failures. This is actually on the 4th iteration of the gearbox, which includes a dual mass flywheel, and it seems they have repaired the issue. I've not heard of any of these gearboxes failing, but experienced owners have found a way to protect the older original gearbox by putting a different gear oil in. So it's always worth doing a bit of research about your car to find out what's best. If you have an automatic, then it's even more important to change the gearbox oil. Not necessarily this kind of automatic, which is a single clutch robotized manual. Essentially what you have under that bonnet is a manual gearbox with a robot bolted to the top of it doing the clutch and the gears for you. But if you have a wet clutch automatic like the DSG fitted to VW, Seat, Skoda and Audi cars, or a torque converter automatic, then I highly recommend you change the gear oil as per the manufacturer's recommendations, if not sooner, because it will extend the life of those gearboxes, and they're incredibly expensive to put right when they go wrong. Replacing your engine oil, your cam chain or your cam belt, your engine coolant and your gearbox oil does not mean you won't get a big bill, but it significantly reduces the chances of you getting a big bill, and you will be left with smaller bills such as your brakes and tyres and suspension components. Modern cars go a very long way when they're looked after, and the chances are it'll go as long as you want it to without a bill that makes you feel like, oh, I need to scrap it, unless of course you crash it. And that neatly leads me on to your brake fluid, which is something many owners overlook. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, meaning it draws in water. Now that's a problem, because when you get water in your brake fluid, well, that water can turn to steam when it's hot, meaning your brake pedal can get spongy and your brakes are less effective. Brake fluid, when it's dry and new, or this one anyway, this DOT 4, has a boiling point of 269 degrees Celsius, but when it's wet, which means 3% water, it has a boiling point of 163 degrees Celsius. That's a lot lower. That's over 100 degrees Celsius lower when it's got 3% water in it. Generally, you're going to change your brake fluid every 2 to 3 years, and it normally costs around £60. If you go to a garage, they can check how much water's in it with one of these things. You want to make sure your brake fluid is between the min and max markers on your reservoir. And when you unscrew this top, you can put this probe thing, if I turn it on, in the fluid, and it will tell me how much water's in there. And it's telling me it's got just over 1%. So this is still good. Generally, you want to keep it below 3%. It's not just about how you maintain the car, but how you treat it when you drive it. When you get in the car, first thing you should do is get the engine running. That way the fluids can circulate. Then put your seatbelt on, set the controls, how you want it to be, like the heater and your sat nav, plug your phone in, do your wipers if you need to do them, turn your lights on, and that gives the car about 10 seconds just to get everything circulating. Then drive it gently, try to avoid anything more than half throttle and 3000 RPM until the coolant gets up to 90 degrees Celsius. That's when it's up to temperature. This is the coolant here. It's currently on the minimum mark. 90 means it's up to temperature, and I can get a more accurate reading here. There's coolant. It's not registered. It's too low. It registers when it gets to 50 on this one, and the oil also registers when it gets to 50. Oil, I don't drive hard until the oil gets above 50 degrees Celsius, and ideally I like the coolant to be fully up to temp. Not all cars have an oil temperature gauge or even a coolant temperature gauge. If that's the case, try and drive it, as I said, less than half throttle, less than 3,000 RPM for 10 minutes to give it a chance to heat up. Now the coolant's up to temperature and the oil is hot enough, I'm quite happy to put my foot down hard and give it some revs. It's what the engine's designed to do. If I have the opportunity to give it a bit of power or use a bit of power, because I quite enjoy it, I do it. It doesn't seem to affect the life of my cars. But if you did it when it's cold, well, that's really not good for your engine. Engines are put through some rigorous testing when they're in development. They're designed to rev and they're designed to produce their max power. You don't get to put your foot down very often on the road, but on the occasions that you do, if your engine's up to temperature, I wouldn't worry too much about engine wear. Don't do it when the engine's cold, and if you have a turbo like this car, it is a good idea to drive gently for the last half minute, just to let the oil circulate so it can cool down the turbo before you switch it off. I even take some of my cars on track where I'm giving full throttle, full revs for long periods of time, and I don't get engine problems. I do get problems on track, and that's generally tyre problems and brake problems. Tyres wear very quickly and sometimes poorly, and the brakes can overheat, so I have to fit special high temperature brake pads that can deal with the heat. As promised, here are 3 ways to check your coolant is good. Earlier I said you shouldn't mix pink with blue or blue with pink, but it's not that simple these days because manufacturers of coolant don't follow a strict colour code. They can use whatever colour they like for the coolant they create. So it's really important to check your owner's manual and make sure you get the correct specific coolant for your car and not just rely on colour. I recommend going to the dealer because they should know what coolant your car needs, and it's not often that expensive. When it comes to filling up your header tank with coolant, you don't want to use pure coolant. You should mix it 50% with water, but not tap water because it has bits in it which can scale up your cooling system. It's better to use pure water like distilled water, or you can buy ready mixed coolant where you don't have to do the mixing yourself. Firstly then, let's see how we can check that the coolant will protect your car in cold conditions. So you've got to take the cap off the reservoir or the header tank, whatever you want to call it. You've got to be very careful doing this. You want the engine running and you want it to be roughly up to temperature. Now with this cap, I have to turn it many times so it depressurizes itself gently. Don't do a quarter turn radiator cap. Don't take that off when it's hot. That's dangerous. If you want to get it hot safely, what you can do is take the cap off, turn the engine on and let it heat up for a little bit so it doesn't pressurize. Now, you need to get one of these tools. I'll leave a link in the description to what it's called. It's like a pipette, and what you do is you squeeze the top, suck up some coolant, and then the thing in the middle, there you go, the float will float. There you go, it's floating now. And how high the coolant is on the float tells me what it's protecting the car down to. And at the moment, this car is protected down to about -40, which is about right. You want it between -30 and -40. You don't want the concentration of coolant to be too strong or too weak. Don't fill up your car with pure coolant. You will get problems if it's too strong or too weak. So this is good on that side of things. Don't know why I'm going to put the cap back on. I've got some other tests to do. So it's protecting the engine down to around -40, which is good. Between -30 and 40 is what you want. -30 and -40 is what you want, in case I mince my words a little bit there. Now I'm going to check to see how much electricity is going through the coolant. This is one of the reasons why you want the engine running. So you've got full current, full voltage, 14 volts roughly. So you've got to set one of these, this is called a multimeter, to DC volts above 14. On this multimeter, the next one above 14 is 20. So 20 DC volts. And then you've got to put the positive in the coolant and the negative on the negative of the battery. Now the battery isn't always handy in here, but the way cars generally work is the negative of the battery connects to the bodywork of the car, So the body actually acts as the negative wires for your car. That way you don't have to have so many wires in your car. It saves weight, it saves costs. So you don't actually have to put this on the negative of the battery. You can put it on the engine or a metal part of the body. Doesn't work if you have an aluminium car, a carbon fiber car, or fiberglass car. Has to be a steel car for this to work. So let me do that then. There's the battery here, and it wants to be below 0.3 volts. If it's above that, you're going to have electrolysis in your coolant, and that's going to cause corrosion in your engine. So I'm going to put that on the negative of the battery, positive in there, in the coolant, and it's 0.1 volts, 0.11 volts. That's great. It's below 0.3, so therefore it's not too much electrolysis, if I can say that word, occurring in the engine. And then there's one final test you can do to test the acidity of the coolant with litmus paper. Here we go, I've got some here. It needs to be alkali, not acid. So it needs to be above pH 7. Simply dip the paper. You probably use this stuff at school. Dip the paper in the coolant, doesn't take long. Quickly dip. It's changed colour, that's good, and it is, yeah, it's a 9, a pH 9, I'd say. So that's nice and alkali, therefore it's protecting the engine. If you're wondering what the sounds are coming from the engine, get the microphone a bit closer. You can hear like a rapid ticking, like a sound. They're the injectors. That's normal, you're going to hear that. But also on this car at the moment, you can hear like a slower, louder tap. It's like a sound. I don't know if you can hear that on camera. That's not normal. Normally it's the hydraulic lifters on the valves, but they're working fine on this car. What it is on this car is the clutch. After about 40,000 miles of learners doing harsh gear changes, the friction disc of the clutch, the damper mechanism in the middle of that disc, starts to have some play in it and it starts to rattle. So when it's in neutral with the clutch up and there's no load under the clutch, it does rattle. When I have the clutch taken out, it's not worn. It's only about 20% worn after 40,000 miles. But unfortunately, this clutch isn't that good at handling harsh gear changes and stalling, dropping the clutch by accident, that kind of thing. So it does start to rattle. But instead of worrying about your oil, your coolant, your brake fluid, just get your car serviced as it should be. If you go to a good garage, when they service your car, they won't only change the oil and the oil filter, but they will check the coolant, the brake fluid, your tyres, your brakes, and the suspension components to make sure they are as they should be. But they'll also change the filters, your cabin filter, which is useful. That stops leaves and pollen getting into your cabin when you're driving along, and even bits of grit sometimes, which find their way into your eye. If you've ever driven a car without a cabin filter, you'll know what I mean. And the air filter for the engine, because when that gets clogged up, your engine runs less efficiently. So keeping that fresh means you get good miles to the gallon, or at least as good as your car engine can handle. If you want to know what those tools were I used, I'll leave a link in the description and I'll find out what that pipette thing is called. I think it's called a refractometer or something, but they're the things you hold to your eye and look through, and I've not used one of those, so it might be called something else. I bought it years ago, so I don't remember. My advice doesn't guarantee anything. It only decreases your chance of getting a big bill, making it feel like you need to scrap the car, and increases your chance of the car lasting as long as you want it to. Generally, the final nail in the coffin for a very well maintained car is structural corrosion. It fails the MOT because there's too much rust or corrosion in the structure, therefore it's no longer safe to drive. But with modern cars and how well they're protected and they're galvanized, most of them, you don't have to worry about this until they're 25, 30 years old. Most cars anyway, there are exceptions, but generally you're going to be fine. Well, I hope this video helps you make your car last longer. If you think it will, please give it a thumbs up. Check out Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, Collingwood can help, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy. Via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 Amazon gift card. If you're insuring your own car, check out confused.com. You fill out one quote form, get loads of quotes back from different insurers to see who's cheapest. And you can change the car on that quote as many times as you like to find out how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.